Everybody.
Sorry, meeting went long over there.
That's okay. Pardon me? I was volunteer. What did Jackie volunteer me for?
Nikita said she was going to force you. So.
Oh, you did. I always thought that was my sister's job to volunteer me for everything. Yeah, that's okay. Well, that's true. Sister and spiritual sister, absolutely. Absolutely. Yep, like that's their job, to make sure you do what I want you to do, all right?
John, homework help for like biology.
Oh, that I can do.
I know.
That I can do.
I'm aware.
All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. I've missed you guys. We took 2 weeks off. I spent that whole entire time actually creating the next few weeks of material, so that was actually good to do that. So let's go ahead and pray before we start the prophets. Father, thank you so much for helping us to understand this information. Thank you for giving us a desire to learn more about your Old Testament and to learn about how it relates to the New Testament. That we can't separate the two, but they're both combined as one. Father, thank you that you are awesome and wonderful. Father, please bless us and please help us to see what you want us to see today. In Jesus' name. So we're going to talk about the prophets today. So the prophets are actually really great. Now, the thing is, when most people look at the prophets, they see doom and gloom. And that is not at all what the prophets were here to do. And we're going to go through that. Today, I am going to go through all 16 prophetic books today at one time. We're going to tell you guys a little bit about everything to help you guys to understand the whole picture of the prophets and what to do, how to study the prophets, what to look for, and everything else. And I promise you, it is going to enrich your life. However, in 190 BC, after being back in the land for 348 years, we're going to get to that in 2 weeks, the Greek culture came like a tsunami to the Jews. Okay? It was estimated that 30 to 40% of the Jews turned away from Judaism and to the Greek culture. They even went as far to have their circumcision corrected. Well, not corrected, but changed. All right? These guys went and had literally a sex change, in a sense. Because the reason why, and because once they got in, the Greeks would build these big gymnasiums and they would always go naked. And to the Jews, like, we're not doing that. But what the Jews, now that they're starting to go towards the Greek culture, now we wanted to look like them. Sounds very familiar like today, doesn't it? It's amazing how history repeats itself. This will lead into a huge battle and a new celebration. Some of you may know what that celebration is. We'll go into that later. But we're going to cover that in the intertestamental period. Now, sorry I put 2 weeks. It may not be 2 weeks. We actually may push this to the history of the church, which is coming up. So the elder's going to decide what they want to do. And whichever it is, it doesn't matter to me. I'm just happy to do whatever they want. And I'm just grateful to be here. But the key is everybody needs to be here for the intertestamental period, because I promise you it will enrich your life to understand who the Pharisees, the Sadducees were, what the synagogues were, what brought about tax collectors, what about the Sumerians, what about King Herod, what about all these guys. So we're going to go into all that stuff. So this is just a little tidbit. All right, so how do we study the prophets? Well, first and foremost, who did they proclaim their message to? That is very important. If you understand who they're talking to, like whether they're talking about Edom, or whether they're talking about Assyria, Babylon, Israel, Judah, whatever it is, that will help you to understand why they were saying what they do. And a lot of the doom and gloom message will disappear once you start seeing who they're talking to. When did they proclaim their message? Was it during the Assyrian captivity? Was it prior to the Assyrian captivity? Was it during the Babylonian period? Because that message will be very, very specific to that time and whatever king they're talking about. Okay, what are they trying to proclaim? Are they saying, stop looking to idols, turn away and come back to God? Maybe they're just crying out to God about something. But the key is make sure you have a study Bible. To understand the prophets, you really need a study Bible. And if you want, after church today, or whenever, I can go over what I use. Now, granted, you don't have to have an iPad. I prefer this. It's actually much easier to use this. But I can show you guys what I do, because let me tell you, if you do a little bit of research prior to going through the prophets, it'll change everything. John Toy even told me that he likes to go through the Bible in 1 year. Some people like to do that. So what you do is you have a study Bible so that when you're reading it, you can do a little research before, a little research during, and I promise you, it will enrich you like crazy. You'll end up loving the prophets. But more than anything else, the most important thing to do before you go to these guys is to ask God, show me what you want me to see. God, what do you want me to see about this? He will open your brain to some things that you've never thought about. That is awesome. How do we classify the minor prophets? Now, we're going to talk about the minor prophets, and we'll talk about why we call them minor prophets. Well, Ecclesiasticus, an apocryphal book, you'll understand when we go through the intertestamental period, we'll talk about the Apocrypha, was written to the 1st century BC, and they wrote of the 12. Okay? This came from the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation, which we'll go into in the intertestamental period. Because remember, in the New Testament, they only used Greek. Josephus, which we will get into in the next 2 weeks, talked about the 12 in the 1st century. Augustine, in his famous book, City of God. Now, if you've never read the book City of God, we'll talk about that during church history, I think it's in May. Let me tell you, City of God by Augustine was after the Bible, the #1 selling book in history prior to about 1950. For 1,300 years, it was the #1 selling, after the Bible, the #1 selling book. It's that famous and that important. And you've probably never even heard of it. So that's why we're going to study church history to help you guys, because I tell you, the City of God is a phenomenal book by Augustine. Okay, and so he called them the minor prophets, Augustine did. Not because they are less important, but because of their size. The books have less chapters than the major prophets. However, both Hosea and Zephaniah actually have more chapters than Daniel does. They both have 14. Daniel, for a long time, the Jews don't even include Daniel in the prophets at all. The Jews actually put in the Torah, when they have the Torah, the Jews actually put him as one of the historical books, like Chronicles and Kings. And so it's the Protestants, or the Christians are the one actually put him in there. And, because he only has 12 chapters. But, whatever. In the early scriptures, they put them before the major prophets. However, in keeping with Jewish scriptures, they eventually put them after the major prophets. So basically what that means is the Christians used to put the minor prophets in the beginning. Now we only find them in the end after major prophets. So that's how they're kind of put together. So the major prophets come first, and then we have the minor prophets. All right. Who are the prophets? So we have a little video we're going to watch.
I am here.
Put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground. I am the God of thy father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob.
Lord, Lord, why do you not hear the cries of their children in the bondage of Egypt?
I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt, and I have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. Therefore I will send thee, Moses, unto Pharaoh, that thou...
Okay, well, oh my gosh, I can't believe it. Angela was right. God does use the King James Version. I knew it. Oh my gosh, all this time. All right, now, but I put that in there for a reason because of this. So let's read what God said in Exodus 20. When the people saw the thunder and lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain and smoke, they trembled. They stayed at a distance and told Moses, "Speak to us yourself, and we will listen, but do not have God speak to us directly." God spoke to them from the mountain. God spoke to Moses directly. But the people were scared, and I don't blame this. They had this mountains here, all this fire and lightning, everything coming down, and God's, Moses. You know, anyway. But the thing is, though, they did not want God to speak to them directly. So in Deuteronomy, it talks about what the people want and what God wants in a prophet. So this is kind of an overview it's a very long passage, so I didn't put it up here, but so God will speak through the prophets. In Deuteronomy, God says, I'm going to speak through the prophets because at Horeb, what we just read, you didn't want me to speak to you directly. Okay? But they must only speak what God instructs them to do. That's another key of the prophets. If he speaks wrongly, that is not meaning that's not from God. He is to be stoned to death. If you go and you're a prophet and you go and prophesy him wrongly, you're going to get stoned. Then the way you know that the prophets are telling the truth is that it will come true. So basically, God says, test it. If it comes true, you know it's from me. Now, I wonder if we should use the same measure with these guys. I mean, come on, weathermen, politicians, man, you can never tell what those guys are telling. All right, I mean, wouldn't that have changed like a whole entire political system and saying, all right, guys, if I find one thing you're saying is a lie, then you're going to get stoned. We would have no politicians at all. What the heck? And the weathermen, if you don't tell us the correct weather, you're out. They'd all quit. All right, so let's start with Hosea, which is the first. We're going to start with the minor prophets. Each of these guys, I'm going to tell you either if they're going to be north or south prophets. Now, someone tell me, what does it mean to be a northern prophet? Who do they speak to? Israel. Right, they spoke specifically to Israel. Who did they speak to if they were a southern prophet? Judah. Yes, Judah. Very good. Good, you guys learned. That's excellent. So, circa 758 to 725, remember, the Syrian exile happened in 722. That's why it's a good thing to know the dates, because, so this guy was really preaching during the time of, right before the Assyrian exile. God actually had him marry a prostitute. Yikes. Because God wanted them to understand that they were prostituting themselves to other gods. Now, you all know, because you've been through this class, what was the number one problem of Israel, the northern kingdom? What did they do? Idolatry. My gosh, they were hardcore idolaters. And again, we use the word synchronistic. What does synchronistic mean? Yes, combining multiple things together as one. So they were, they were somewhat Jews, somewhat, whatever else, Baal, whatever it is. Yeah. So what ended up happening is she was unfaithful to him, and he actually had to go and buy her back. So his message was that of, you are prostituting yourself to these idols instead of to me. And let me tell you, if you read Hosea now after knowing that, trust me, you'll understand exactly, especially after going through this class, you go home and read Hosea, you'll be like, oh, totally, I understand what that means now because of what they did. So that's Hosea. Amos was another northern prophet. 760 to 750. This was actually prior to Tiglath-Pileser actually taking the first people away. But one of the things he did, he not only spoke to Israel, he also spoke to the surrounding nations. So someone tell me, what is one of the surrounding nations? Egypt was not necessarily a surrounding nation, but that's close. No, Greece was way far away. And actually, Greece weren't even around at this time. Edom, that's one. What's another one? What about Ammon? Moab, Tyre, Sidon, Philistines. Those are the big guys. So one thing I recommend, and good job guys, one thing I really recommend you doing is going back through I believe it was the second lecture in this class. We go through all those guys again. I highly recommend you guys going back. It's on YouTube. And go back through and looking into who is Edom, who is the Philistines, Tyre, Sidon, those guys. Very nice. All right. Basically what they were doing is they were having extravagant indulgence in luxurious living, immortality, corruption of judicial procedure, and oppression of the poor. Is it me, or was he speaking in the 21st century? But the thing is, what was happening is, during this time in Israel, they were rich. They actually were starting, if I remember right, that time, they actually took over Moab. And they were like running Moab. So what they were doing, they were selling the poor into slavery. They were selling each other. Remember the law we went through? You're not supposed to do that. How many years were you only supposed to take someone for? 7. Yes, 7 years. That's right. Good job. He also announced the coming of Assyria. Amos is a great book. Joel. We're not really sure when Joel was written, but Joel basically claimed most likely around the time of the Babylonian captivity, which we'll go into next week. He spoke from Deuteronomy 28 about locusts. So what I recommend, before you read Joel, I would go back into Deuteronomy and read about the locusts. Then everything will make sense in Joel. The idea was the people to get right, or God will destroy the land. And actually, next week we're going to find out that that's exactly what he did. So most likely spoke of the Babylonian invasion and captivity. Most likely. That's probably what he was really talking about. Oops. Obadiah. So Obadiah basically spoke to Edom specifically. When you read Obadiah, understand that he was speaking to Edom, the southern. Now, does anybody remember what Israeli relative came from? I mean, who are the relative of Edom? Esau. Very good. Remember Esau, because Edom means red, like Esau. So when it was Esau, very good. So he was speaking to the people from Esau, which is right up there. Edom was destroyed around the time of Jerusalem. And actually what's interesting also is Psalm 137 specifically names Edom while the people were in captivity with Babylon. They actually, in Psalm 137, they're talking about by the rivers of Babylon, and they're talking about Edom, how Edom actually betrayed them. Yeah, Edom was not a really nice people. From the very beginning, they just weren't that great. Jonah. So basically, around 797, Elijah spoke to the king of Israel concerning the future victories of Damascus. A few years later, Jonah prophesied the restoration of Jeroboam II. So, Jonah's actually mentioned in Kings also, 2 Kings also. You probably didn't know that, but Jonah's he's one of the few guys who are actually mentioned in Kings. But Jonah specifically spoke to Nineveh. Was Nineveh a bad place? It was very bad. Remember we talked to last week that or a couple weeks ago, they're putting people on poles. They were flaying their skin off. They were just terrible people. So Jonah's one of 2 prophets that actually spoke to Nineveh specifically. One of 2. So Jonah wasn't the other one. So basically, he basically went and preached to Nineveh. And do you guys remember the ending? Did Nineveh turn away? Yeah, they did. Sadly, they didn't stay that way, but they did. So, Micah prophesied sometime between 750 and 686. All right? Around the reigns of Ahaz, Hezekiah, and the kings of Judah. So he was So kings of Judah means he was a southern prophet. Prophesied the fall of Samaria, which is right about the time, because remember, so he really, well, if he prophesied in 715, it was actually after the fall of Samaria. But anyway, what he was talking about is religious and social conditions. So they were cheating people. The courts were bad. He was doing. Israel also had a lot. I'm sorry, Judah had a lot of idols that they were worshiping, and Hezekiah was actually a very good king. Came in and took care of that. Nahum also spoke to Nineveh just later on. So Nineveh turned back, was evil again. So brutality reached its peak under that guy. I don't want to try that one. The last great ruler of the Assyrian Empire. After his death, Assyria's influence and power rapidly waned until 612 when Nineveh was overthrown. Most likely, during that guy's reign, that's when Nahum went there and talked about that. By the way, that is a clay tablet that spoke about Nineveh. That's actually, and can you read it? Yeah, I can. It says in there Nineveh. Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, I can read that. Yeah. Anyway, Habakkuk. Now, I think this guy is from North Carolina because that's where they grow all the tobacco. Tobacco. No, it's Habakkuk. So I always think the guy Habakkuk. I lived in North Carolina it was funny. North Carolina's a trip because you'll drive through this one town, you go out this way or this way, and all of a sudden you'll just see this little tobacco field. People will just grow these things and sell them to the tobacco company, all these weeds. It was terrible. It was just an interesting place. Anyway, the message was a series of complaints to God and God's answers. Basically, this guy, what he did is he cried out to God. I tell you, this is an awesome book to read because the whole book was him saying, God, there's a lot of bad things going on here. But you know what? God answered him and told him things. He wasn't preaching against anybody. He was basically saying, God, what do we do about this? This is good to learn because if you need to learn how to pray and cry out to God, Habakkuk can help you with that. Very, very nice. Because he's like one of the only guys who just really never spoke against anybody, didn't stand up and preach to anybody, but what he did is he cried out to God, and God answered him. So Habakkuk is that's a great book. Zephaniah prophesied during the reign of Josiah, which 640 to 609, making him a contemporary of Jeremiah, Nahum, and perhaps Habakkuk from North Carolina. Like other prophets, he proclaimed the judgment of God to be brought on Judah. Because remember, by the time this happened, 640, remember, Assyria took them away in 722, and 640, they're about 40 years from being taken away themselves. Like the other prophets, he proclaimed the judgment. He spoke of God's judgment on the nations, and most likely when Babylon comes through, it will affect the nations, the Middle East, and Egypt. It's a short book, by the way. Zephaniah is actually a pretty short book. Haggai prophesied during the 4-month period in 520. Now, by the way, that's wrong. It's actually 620 because 520, they were back in the... Oh, my fault. Never mind. That is right. Sorry, this is Babylonian exile. So next week, we're going to go into the Babylonian exile, and in 2 weeks, we're going to talk about the return from exile. Haggai is one of 3 prophets that is very specific to the Babylonian return from exile. All of these guys, none of these three guys, none of them spoke about God's judgment, because God's judgment is already done. They're coming back from exile. And so what he was doing is that there was a problem with building the new temple. He was encouraging them to do that. And again, we haven't went there yet, but we're going to get to that in 2 weeks on the new temple. So we talked to Zerubbabel, which we'll go into all that. So this may not really mean anything to you now, but it will in 2 weeks. Zechariah was another one coming from post-Babylonian exile. He actually ministered to Haggai. He even ministered to, they think he might have ministered even into the reign of Artaxerxes, which we'll get to. Again, we're going to take a whole entire class and go through all those kings, who they were, what happened during the diaspora, and everything else. So we'll get to those guys later. Malachi, or if you're from Italy, Malachi, may have had been written around Nehemiah's time. We will get to that again. In 2 weeks, we're going to go through Nehemiah, Esther, all those guys, Ezra, those guys. So we'll get to him in a few days or a few weeks. All right, Isaiah. Wow, this is a big guy. This is one of our 4 major guys. Isaiah ministered from 740 to 681. So that should help you understand, because remember, it was like 732 to 722 is the 10 years that they have the people Israel being taken away. So which means that he spoke during that time. He preached both to the north and the south. Isaiah lived a really stormy period because the Assyrians were pretty nasty guys. They almost destroyed Jerusalem. Okay? Considered the gospel of the Old Testament. Basically, they call this the 5th gospel. And the reason why is because there's so many references to Jesus in it, and salvation, everything else, all the way through the book, that and it's interesting because remember when Jesus came to the synagogue? Who did he actually read from? Isaiah. Yeah, Isaiah. So Isaiah had some really awesome things. Unfortunately, Isaiah, his book's kind of broken down into like 3 or 4 main parts. So really use a study Bible, because sometimes it gets a little muddy to try to understand what he's talking about, but it's pretty awesome. So he actually referenced Cyrus the Great. Now, we'll learn that in 2 weeks when we go to the return from exile. But basically what Isaiah said is 140 years prior to this guy even coming in, Isaiah said, this guy is going to help you guys. So God told them 140 years early, and what's interesting, he named the guy. I mean, come on, out of any name in the world, why? God just said, no, his name's going to be Cyrus. Cyrus the Great. 538, he's going to bring him back. Isaiah warned Judah of the sin that would bring captivity at the hands of the Babylonians. So here is the interesting thing. So right at the end, around the time of Hezekiah's kingship, Babylon came knocking. Now remember, this was still under the Assyrian rulers, but Babylon came and knocked. And let's go over this real quick. In Isaiah 39, 1 and 2, an envoy of Babylon. So basically they're going to come and say, what they did is they came to Hezekiah and said, it's like, Hezekiah, yes, can we see the treasures of your temple? They wanted to see, because Hezekiah was pretty rich. Guess what? Hezekiah said, yeah, guys, come on in. Let me show you what the temple looks like. We're envoys for Babylon. we're nice guys. I'd love to see what you guys have here. That's probably not the smartest thing in the world. It's kind of like, the president taking Vladimir Putin into Fort Knox and showing him. I mean, not the smartest thing in the world to do. So what Isaiah said was that was really dumb. So basically what he said was that the Babylons will take everything away. Babylon, what they were doing is they're going around and saying, who are the rich people around here, rich countries? We'd like to find out. Because when they come, we're coming here first. And actually, they did come, and they did take a lot of stuff. The Babylonians would take everything, carry it to Babylon. That's exactly what happened. But it will not happen in Hezekiah's time. Hezekiah was one of the very few good kings. He really made some great reforms. He just did some stupid things in the end, like all of us do. And inviting Babylon in to look at our treasures, hey, let me show you what we got. Not the best thing to do. So they called the fifth gospel. Beautiful language of God's salvation is found out through the book. And I'm sure you've all read a lot of it. Isaiah is phenomenal when it comes to God speaking of salvation coming. So according to legend, not found in the Bible, Isaiah was killed by evil King Manasseh. So I believe it was Josephus who talked about this. But according to legend, he was sawed in half. Manasseh was the worst king. We'll talk about him next week. We'll mention Manasseh next week. Manasseh was a really, really bad guy. Not sure if this is true or not, but we know he at least was killed. Ezekiel, he was one of two prophets. Now, this is important to know. There were two prophets that were taken away to Babylon. They never prophesied from Judah. They only prophesied from Babylon. Ezekiel was one, and who was the other? Daniel. Yes, Daniel. Daniel and Ezekiel. Good job. Good job. Daniel and Ezekiel were the two guys that were taken away, and it's right up here too. Sorry. Good job, guys. I guess you guys you pulled that out of thin air, didn't you? Well, I guess it's right up there. That's true. Okay. For some reason when I saw this picture and I was thinking of Ezekiel and all the problems he went through, I actually own this painting. This is the painting by Raphael, the School of Athens. But you know what? I love this painting because it just reminds me of all the prophets. Because you could picture, now granted, these guys, this is Plato and Aristotle and all those guys. All those guys are pictured here by Raphael. But if you could actually put in Isaiah, Daniel, Ezekiel, you could actually see them in this picture. Raphael could have talked about them instead, but yeah. So I actually own this painting. I love this painting. All right. God used Ezekiel to point out many things to the Judeans in exile. Basically what he did was, once the initial people were taken away, he basically said, I'm going to have you, and he had them do all these different things. The idea was to show the people, you messed up. You blew it. You did a terrible job. Now you're here. So the people at first were still bewildered at the fact they were in exile, but God helped to bring them back to reality. He was among the second wave of captivities, which we'll get to next week, the Babylonian exile. First wave with Daniel went in. Through visions and numerous actions, he attempted to get the people to realize they turned away from God and only God could help them. So you're going to see a huge transition because of Ezekiel, that next week we'll talk about the Babylonian captivity of what led up to it. The week after, when they come back from Babylon, you're going to see a changed people. Nothing like going and getting hauled off into captivity and living by the rivers of Babylon to make you change your ways. Ezekiel had a vision in Ezekiel 10. This was actually quite amazing, this vision. Basically what it was Ezekiel had a vision from God that the glory of God was departing the temple. Think about it. What if you saw God leaving this church. That would be scary. It'd scare me to death. The glory of God and God's favor and God's love for us left because the people didn't want him. So you got to remember, these people are synchronistic by this time. They weren't serving him. They didn't care. They were cared only about themselves. And, God showed Ezekiel that he actually gave him a vision of him just leaving the temple. Oof. It's kind of scary. A little chilling, I'd say. So, but in Ezekiel 24, God showed him the time. See, he was in Babylon during this time, but in Ezekiel 24, God did destroy the temple. So right afterwards, so Ezekiel 10 tells him that. Ezekiel 24, right afterwards, it's going to be, they're actually going to destroy it under Nebuchadnezzar. All right, Daniel. So in the Hebrew Bible, Daniel's placed in the writings, which we talked about. He was actually placed in where Kings and Chronicles was. In the Christian Bible, he's one of the 4 of the major prophets. We talked about that. Daniel was taken to Babylon along with other noble and elite captives. Basically, these were the smart people, the rich, the elite. Now, in America, everybody has a chance to go to college and everything else now, but back in time, before, in the 1800s and even way before, the only people who could go to college, the only people who were educated were the rich, because they could afford tutors. So that's why when Nebuchadnezzar came through the first time in 605, he took all the rich kids away, because they were the smart people. They were the people who had the knowledge and everything else. So that's why he did that. He took them away so that they would be ministers in Babylon. He was one of the best known prophets. We all know that. Daniel in the lion's den, all that kind of stuff. However, Daniel's prophecy turned out to be quite accurate, especially more than 500 years of time. Daniel prophesied about all of the different people coming back into, so basically prophesied about Greece, Rome, Babylon, Persia. Pretty amazing how God did that. So the only thing is I'm going to warn you is that be careful when you start going through some of these prophecies that you don't really understand. Like, when it talks about this how many days and this many days and this, there's nothing wrong with it, but just be careful because sometimes it can get a little muddy and people start going way off this direction. And the reason why I'm saying that is because one of the great leaders that I looked to for many years, Chuck Missler, that's what happened to him. He got into numerology and got numbers and how is God speaking through this number or this number? I mean, they go way off here. So be careful. Always use a study Bible and pray what God wants you to see through that. So when he talks about the 4 kingdoms, that's pretty much, most scholars believe that's who he's talking about. And we actually will go into every one of those. Woohoo! All right, Jeremiah. Jeremiah is a great book to learn about Babylonian history. But Jeremiah is also one of the toughest books to understand because he jumps around. He'll have something going on here, then the next chapter something completely different, then the next, kind of like Ezra is the same way. And so you really got to have a good follow to see what's going on here. What is he doing? Where is he going? Because it really need a good study Bible because he really tends to jump around a lot. Okay, so Jeremiah's prophecy began about 626 and ended at 586. 586 is when the last of the Babylonian captivity happened and they burned the temple down. He had his own scribe named Baruch, which wrote down his words. Jeremiah is often called the weeping prophet because he basically cried out to God, and God showed him a lot of things. He had a pretty tough life. He was thrown into jail. He was thrown into mud up to his neck. He was almost killed multiple times, all because he did what God wanted him to do. So in Jeremiah 25, the whole country will become a desolate wasteland, and these nations will serve the king of Babylon for 70 years. This is awesome because God got it completely right. Now, was it exactly 70 years? Was it not 70 years? Regardless, it was 68. Regardless if it was 72, what does it matter? It was still only 70 years they were in exile. And then they were able to come back. So Jeremiah prophesied this. And what's interesting, in 2 weeks when we look at Ezra, Ezra is going, the very first thing he talks about is this, is the 70 years. He said, yep, God brought him back just like he promised. All right. Jeremiah so one of the things Jeremiah did, basically the kings and people came to him, and we'll talk about this next week, said, hey, what do we do? Babylon is on the way to us. And they're like, should we look to Egypt? Jeremiah said, don't look to Egypt. Don't, just do what the Babylonians want you to do. Do this and you'll be fine. God, even towards the end, was telling people what to do, saying, look, just don't do this. Don't do this. But they did it anyway. So they looked to Egypt, and Egypt did not help them. They were destroyed. But we'll talk this next week. What happened to Jeremiah? Well, afterwards, there is a tradition that he was killed by stoning in Egypt. Okay? He was killed in Egypt. So actually what's interesting is Nebuchadnezzar let him go. Released him from prison, said, you're on your own. See you later. So, but some say he went to Babylon, but most people say he went to Egypt. So make sure you come next week, because we will talk about the Babylonian exile. This is going to be so important. I mean, if there are two major times after the return from Egyptian captivity that are the two most important times, the first one to know is the Assyrian exile. The Assyrians. What led up to that, and what led up to the wiping out of Israel? The second one is very pivotal. That is going to be the Babylonian exile. What led up to that? Because in the Babylonian exile, they went away only to come back and be able to rebuild again. God gave them a second chance. And we will go into that next week. It's one of the most pivotal points in history. I would say a large majority I think there was probably like 12 or more books of the Bible actually talk about the Babylonian captivity. So, pretty important. So, is there any questions about this information? I know it's a lot. Yes, ma'am. Oh, they sell it everywhere. Yeah, and actually, some of your, if you have like an iPad or a computer or a phone or whatever, you can actually get it on some things. But we're actually going to go over that too. So, but it's very good. It's a very good thing. The City of God was actually written because once Rome fell, once Rome was destroyed, people thought everything was done. They thought it was over. They thought life was over as we know it. And it was going to be very hard for them. And what he did is he wrote City of God to tell people, hey, guess what? It's not over. There's good things. God is here. And this is not a city of, because they thought Rome was everything. Now they're saying, no, it's the city of God is the most important thing. And actually, that's good news for us in America, because it's not America that's the most important thing. It's the city of God. So, any other questions? We are right on time. Woohoo! Look at that. So, all right, guys, enjoy. Have a